In this presentation we're going to look at the story of the Bible and how it came to us. Still a world bestseller, always seems to have been with us. A lot are printed annually every year, but there's no way of quantifying how many are downloaded digitally. The Bible is a compilation of 66 books for many churches. These are written by a whole range of authors over perhaps 1,000 years, but we can't be exactly certain the time scale. Divided into the Old Testament. Now the Roman Catholics have 7 more books, and we'll see why that is so in a moment or two. Starts with the story of Abraham and the people group that he founded. There are books of prophecy, but that word prophecy is greatly misunderstood. It's not fortune telling. Prophecy is where someone declares the mind of God. They grasp what God thinks about a situation, and they declare the mind of God for a specific situation in a specific context, and they share that with others. There are also books involving poetry and the accumulated wisdom of that people group. The New Testament, there are 27 books here. 4 focus on the life of Jesus. Then there's a book that discusses and outlines the early growth and development of the followers of Jesus. The numbers grew exponentially over the first century or two, but it only covers the first decade or two. Then there are many letters, and these assisted that development, written to groups of the followers of Jesus all over the Roman Empire. So in a sense, the Bible is a book that outlines how God interacts with a family, a people group that derive from that family, and then wider humanity. So there's a sequence in the thoughts, they expand out. A story of God's interaction with humanity. Bit of history. The time the books came into being, they were spoken and then written down. Now we can't be too sure, but perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. One language mainly for the Old Testament, and one language almost entirely in the New. People were able to memorize that and preserve it, corporate memory, a skill that humanity still has today. But in the days before there was writing, and people could not read or write, or very few could, then teamwork memorization was the way to keep information alive and accurate, carefully preserved when it went into writing, but there was also guidance given to understand it. Now printing didn't exist then, so every copy of every book was copied laboriously and meticulously by hand by trained scribes who could read and write. They were able to read it to the ordinary people because the majority could not read or write. Usually using papyrus scrolls, and they were stored, these scrolls, with great care. It took a lot of time to produce one scroll of one book, and they often used earthenware vessels for safekeeping, a kind of library of the past. From time to time there was careful editing of these books because language changes, so the language was updated, and the way language was expressed, for example, in the early days they didn't have punctuation, so slowly that had to be added. And the books were gathered together into some kind of a library. Today, That is just mind-blowing. The work, the commitment that has led to that, it's quite amazing. But there are lots of questions about the Bible, things where we ask, how do you know? How do we know? What was the original text? Copies of copies of copies of copies? And were the copies always accurate? Which books are included and on what basis? And then, coming up to date, which translation is best for us to use today? Is it correct? Has it captured the meaning correctly? And then why would God communicate through a book? We're going to address some of these questions in this presentation. Let's think first of all about communication. We're used to that. Perhaps there's a model for that. If you think about it for a moment, we use all sorts of ways to communicate with each other, not just speaking. A lot of communication comes through the visual, through body language, through actions. It's a far more natural way to communicate, perhaps, than through books. How does God communicate with you and me? He can speak to us. He can show us things through the visual or through Him acting. God intervening and acting within history. We could call that the inner voice. The visual involves things that the world around says to us about the Maker. When we look at how the world is constructed and works, it speaks volumes about the Maker. But there also are dreams and visions, far more widely occurring from God to humans than sometimes we care to admit. And God can speak to us through the events of life. And He can draw our attention to things and make us come to a halt and rethink things through the events of life. And now there's a kind of principle. It underpins the way the Bible was developed. God communicates with individuals who are willing to listen. The authors of the biblical text were willing to listen. Sometimes it cost them everything. But God wants that what He shared with these individuals, the revelations, are passed on to others. So those who receive these communications pass them on and share them with others. Others who are perhaps not willing to listen so carefully. Let's go back to that picture. God communicating with you and me. And then we share what God has shown to us. Of course, it raises questions. How do we know it's God that has shown them and not just us inventing things? So we have to listen, and we have to listen to others. When God shows us these things, it becomes part of an oral tradition. And that was a powerful way of a kind of community memory in the communities of past generations. Written records have an advantage. They're much more permanent. So, when the ability and the skills of being able to write things down in some way, it made things permanent, and we were no longer so reliant on the oral tradition. But what about other religious texts? Are there no alternatives to the Bible? How do we know the Bible is the text that contains the truth? There are numerous other religious texts. Now, if we go to the Quran, it claims to be a copy of a text held by God in heaven, a verbatim text, a verbatim copy. So, for example, you'll find it in many places, but I've quoted here from one particular verse in the Quran. God is speaking, "We have revealed the Quran in the Arabic tongue that you may understand its meaning," speaking to the Prophet to pass on. "It is a transcript of the eternal book in our keeping, sublime and full of wisdom." That's what the Quran claims of itself, and probably the majority of Muslims today accept. Now, if we look at religious texts of the wide range of religions in the world today, most of them are compilations of the insights of great thinkers of the past, often containing considerable amounts of wisdom and insight too. They often point to ways by which life should be lived. What they don't offer is any insights into the resources and how we can actually live our lives that way, other than self-effort. Now, the Bible, it's a collation from many writers, human beings who listened to God, followed what God was saying, so God directed them, but they listened to God and they used it and expressed it in their own language, in their own culture, in their own context. And they were brought together much, much later by others. So, for example, Paul, writing to a young man called Timothy, says this: all Scripture. Now, he's referring to the Old Testament there, all Scripture, because the New Testament hadn't been compiled. Most of it hadn't yet been written. God breathed. God was speaking. And it's useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting. In other words, it's proved itself to be useful, relevant to life. Training in righteousness. In other words, righteousness, a kind of religious word. Right living, quality lifestyle. So that the servant of God, that's the followers of Jesus, may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Here's the resources coming in, because the Bible points to how we can access the resources of God for a quality lifestyle. So the goal of the Bible is to offer a framework for quality living and to point to the resources that God makes available so that we can experience that quality living. And you'll find other verses in the Bible that give extra insights on that central theme. But if it's a collation, who undertook it? And on what basis did they bring these books together? And then how did the text reach us today, centuries and millennia later? And why do we have so many English translations? Before we address these questions, let's say a little bit about the languages of that time, and indeed language itself. Now, that's usually true. Okay, there's language using visuals, but in general, that's how we think of language today. But words convey meaning. If you like, the words are vehicles of meaning, servants of meaning. The words themselves are not the critical thing, it's the meaning they convey. Hold that in mind, because it helps us to understand the Bible for us today. The written Old Testament comes to us in Hebrew, and the written New Testament in Greek. Not modern Greek, but Greek of about 2,000 plus years ago. These ancient languages, well, let's just start with the language of Aramaic. Very commonly spoken. A language of public life as well as administration of many ancient kingdoms right back to the Assyrian Empire, where it spread widely through the Assyrian Empire. Now we're going back centuries and centuries before the time of Jesus. It was the dominant local language in the days of Jesus in that area. Hebrew developed from a Canaanite religion, is natively spoken by the Israelites when they entered the land known as Canaan, now the land in the Middle East. But it became the liturgical language, the religious language of Judaism, following the exile. We're now up to about 5th century, 6th century-ish BC. And it was reserved for religious settings. So Aramaic was the kind of ordinary language of ordinary people. Hebrew was the religious language by then. Greek, it spread very rapidly. Alexander the Great, a very short time lifespan he had, but he just spread the Greek Empire all over the place. And it became the international language of the Roman Empire when it took over from the Greek Empire, until the Roman Empire split in 476 AD. And then Latin replaced Greek in the West, but Greek remained in the Eastern Empire. Now the New Testament employs Greek, which is the language that really everybody understood at that time. Where does Latin fit in? It's the native language of the Romans and became the international language of the Western Roman Empire area. And it's dominated the Roman Catholic Church ever since. A bit more about history. Various documents written by several over many centuries, and we don't always know who wrote them, but they've been found to offer key insights. In other words, they were proven to be useful by the people who read them down over many centuries. And the ones that were useful were collated. They were put into formal Hebrew sometime after the exile, late 6th century, which is the basis of what we have today. They were translated into Greek around 132 BC in Alexandria, which was a centre of scholarship at the time, but wasn't really a religious centre. New Testament, small number over a period of about 50 years, and we do know who are the authors of most of them. The books were carefully copied and then read, moved around the various groups of the followers of Jesus in the Roman Empire in the first few centuries. Again, some of the books were found to be useful, and a selection was collated and became the kind of books that people found useful, and they were copied and circulated. And that selection was confirmed in 325 AD. Now, the basis of the selection was very, very clear, and this was confirmed in subsequent church councils over the next century or two. It's not just a random selection. It's not just the ones where the ideas suit ourselves. The basis of selection was they were books that had been found to be useful. They helped quality living, Jesus-like living, and they had some direct connection with those known as apostles. Now, the word apostle is not a special word in the original language. It's not a rank or a position. It's just a word that describes someone who is sent with the authority of the sender. And there were many apostles beyond the 12 disciples of Jesus, as our reading of the New Testament shows us. But in other words, they had to be first-hand accounts. People who'd witnessed the events, seen things, and were involved hands-on and directly, and they had to have established usefulness. So these criteria were very precise. It was not a random selection, and it was not a theologically decided selection. Back to the Old Testament. The books were agreed somewhere in that period. We can't be too precise and exact because it's going back a long time in history. Now, Jerusalem was completely destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. These documents were rescued and then preserved in various locations all over the Middle East. The problem was that the Jews who'd been forced to scatter, they were for quite a while, they were forbidden to live in the land by the Roman authorities. They lost the ability to read biblical Hebrew. Other languages had taken over their ordinary lifestyles. So the Jewish Bible, that's the Christian Old Testament, was inaccessible to most. So somewhere in that stretch, probably over a long period of time, groups of Jewish scribes who were experts in reading and writing in the language of Hebrew as well as the languages of the day, they developed readable texts. They worked from the best available manuscripts they had, but they also introduced what we might call modern punctuation. The original texts in Hebrew didn't have any punctuation at all. Sometimes elements of that are known as pointing. So they made the thing up to date and accessible. And that we have copies of, and that's known as the Masoretic text. Now, the Old Testament was translated into Greek, as I mentioned before, and we have copies of that. 20th century discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is a library of books in a desert area where they survive because the humidity is almost zero. And almost every Old Testament book was there except the book of Esther. And we have these as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And all the sections have been photographed so people can study them. Now you can date the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they've been dated by two methods, and they come up with the same answers. The Dead Sea Scrolls must have been gathered together sometime the first 2 centuries, the final 2 centuries BC up to the 1st century AD. So they were there roughly in the days of Jesus. The Bible was translated by Jerome into Latin around 405 BC. Now he used the best manuscripts available at the time, mainly from the Septuagint, but he didn't have access to them all. That translation, a brilliant piece of work, is known as the Vulgate. That word implies the text was to be made available for ordinary people. Now let's look at these originals, all of which we have. The Masoretic text, that's the one that Jews recognize. It's used as the basis of the modern English Old Testament translations today, with a slight exception. And the exception is the Septuagint. It's a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, but it includes 7 books not recognized in the Masoretic text, and the Roman Catholic Old Testament includes these books. The Dead Sea Scrolls, even older but discovered only recently, almost a complete set. And what they do is they confirm the amazing accuracy of the Masoretic text. Now, if you read Islamic literature, the Islamic literature states that there are over 1,000 differences between the Masoretic text and the Deep Sea Scrolls text. Now, they're right, but what they don't tell you is that of the, let's say, 1,000, all but about 3 of them are to do with pointing changes and punctuation changes, or bits that have been rubbed off the bottom of a text with the passage of time. They're not differences in the content of the text. There are almost no differences, just a handful. Some people have estimated about 3, where there's something of substance that's different between the Masoretic and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And while there's something of substance, it's not something world-shaking that alters the total meaning. Often it gives it insight into how it was understood. Now, the Vulgate translation is in Latin, and it's the whole Bible. Now, these are the kind of originals which we have copies of, and overall they tell us a story of remarkable care by the scribes of the past in copying. In places, sometimes the scribes have added wee notes for their own benefit, like we sometimes put a wee note in the margin of our Bibles when something strikes us as very important for us. And occasionally these scribal notes have got incorporated into the text. We'll come back to that in a moment or two. Jump forward to the 15th century. 2 great events took place. Printing was invented in Germany, changed the whole world of communication. Constantinople fell, and the centre of Eastern Christianity was lost. Both had a major impact on the Bible. First of all, printing meant that books now could be mass-produced, mass-produced by the technology of that time. But something very subtle took place. Eastern scholars, Christian scholars, with the fall of Constantinople, started to flee west, and they brought with them very ancient copies of the books of the Bible from the libraries that were all over the Eastern Roman Empire, now Turkey across to the Middle Eastern areas. These had got lost in the West or suppressed. So it gave access to Western scholars to ancient copies of the books in their original languages. So Bible translation and then printing of it both became possible because of these 2 events. And within a century, Tyndale published a translation into English. Now, he was hounded by King Henry VIII of England and settled in parts of the continental area outside England, and he had to move from place to place. Eventually he was betrayed and he died a pretty brutally horrible death on the instructions of King Henry. He managed to translate almost the entire Bible. He was a brilliant scholar, but he didn't have access to the best manuscripts because he was a fugitive. He could only take so much, even with his followers and helpers helping him. But it was a brilliant breakthrough. King James inherited the English throne quite a bit later. We'll come back to why he did this, but that's the origin of the King James Version. In fact, 75, roughly 3/4, is just straight from the Tyndale. But also the translators who worked for him, they lacked access to the best ancient manuscripts. So the King James Version is not the best one to use. 1894, the Revised Version, recognizing the weaknesses of the King James, with better access to better manuscripts, but it was a very literal translation. It doesn't flow and read well. To try and correct that, many years later, the Revised Standard Version, using much more reliable ancient manuscripts, a team of translators, and they had access now to the Dead Sea Scrolls, good language flow, as well as accuracy. And that had a powerful impact on the English-speaking world. Today, the most popular version in the English-speaking world worldwide is the New International Version. Again, a team of scholars. They used the best available ancient manuscripts, and they had even better ones by then that have been discovered in libraries from the Middle East. But later, King James was updated, but essentially it's just a revision of the King James, and it uses slightly more modern English, but it retains the structure and doesn't really deal with the issue of not using the best available ancient manuscripts. This translation, the New Living Bible, the emphasis is slightly different from the New International. The translators tried to convey meaning, not just the literal translation of the words. Never easy, because languages' structures are different. But that one is very readable. And the English Standard Version then built on the brilliant work of the Revised Standard and updated it using better available manuscripts that have become available. These are just some of them, and they're the ones that had the major impact on the world today. Now let's go back and look at the King James one. An awful lot of misunderstandings about this. A long time ago, at the age of 37, James became James the First of England, and he inherited the throne of England because of some previous intermarriage between the royal families of Scotland and England. But he'd been King James the Sixth of Scotland since infancy. His mother had been forced to abdicate. And when he got down into the English nation to be crowned as king, he found a very religiously divided nation. He was highly educated. His mother had fled. His father had been killed. He was brought up by the leading figures in the Scottish establishment, and they were described as nobles, and they appointed a kind of tutor to supervise his education and upbringing and discipline as a child right through to teenage years. And the man they appointed was a very godly, spiritual man. And James was extremely able. He could speak multiple languages, including biblical languages, and he understood an awful lot of things. When he got to England, he wanted to get some religious unity there. So he had the idea that as king, he was the head of the Church of England. Could he enforce them all use the same English Bible? That would be a start. So he appointed all the translators, and they were all drawn from the Church of England, but they represented both theological wings of the Church of England that time. Very roughly, those who held views that were very close to Catholic at one end, and those who held views that were very close to evangelical in modern languages at the other end. They didn't have access to the best Hebrew or Greek manuscripts. So they relied heavily on Tyndale's brilliant translation. So the version is based on late texts of Hebrew and Greek. And what had happened was that over the centuries, scribes had scribbled in comments, really for themselves probably, and they had got incorporated into later versions as part of the text. So in fact the authorized version, the King James Version, contains hundreds of words that have been added that are not in the original Greek or Hebrew manuscripts, now that we've got access to them. Now it doesn't alter the overall meaning, but it does cause considerable confusion. And many people who use the King James criticize modern versions of having removed these. They've cut out bits of our Bible, they say. That's not the case. These bits were not in the original Bible. We're speculating how they got there. We also have to recognize that James wrote it for a political reason. His nation that he'd inherited was split religiously, and that affected all of life. He was the head of the Church of England, and he wanted a clear chain of command, and you can see that if you look through the text, that political dimension coming in here and there. Let's move forward. For us today, whatever translation you use, use one that's based on the best original texts from Hebrew and Greek. Now that straight away rules out the King James and the New King James. The Masoretic text is regarded as the best. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirms it in its accuracy. Use a translation that employs clear modern English. We don't want critics from outside to say you're living in the past with old-fashioned language. And there are numerous modern translations that fit that description. Let's remember that the words are vehicles of meaning. It's the meaning that's important. Some translations emphasize word accuracy. Some emphasize faithfulness to the meaning. Now we're looking for the meaning, but translations that have word accuracy and translations that capture the meaning are both of immense value to us. But meaning relates to context, so do watch this. It worries me to see this text being ripped out of context. Now the text may be meaningful, and this may be helpful at times when it is meaningful, but sometimes they are ripped out of context and applied in a situation which is utterly different from the original context, and you can end up tying ourselves in knots over such issues. 3 perspectives today looking at the Bible. The Catholic Church, and I think along here of the Eastern Orthodox Church as well, based on the Septuagint, but in fact much still reflects the kind of Latin translation of Jerome. And underpinning it, church teaching often holds a higher status than the biblical text, and the biblical text is sometimes bent slightly to fit in with church teaching. The Protestant broad area here, based on the Masoretic text, one of the sad things is the way the flawed King James Version, brilliant in its day, yes, but the flawed King James Version still dominates today. What a message we're putting out to the wider world that we're living in 16th century language. And there's still the tragedy of the excessive literalism in many churches, where verses, phrases and texts are ripped out of context virtually to prove whatever we want it to prove. If you look at the Islamic world, read their literature, they regard the Bible as a good book, but it's been totally corrupted. Now there's no evidence of that, and in fact the enormous consistency between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls undermines it, but they teach that it's been totally corrupted and therefore it's effectively worthless. So there's 3 perspectives on the Bible from religious perspectives today. What about the evidence? That's probably true. If we look at the Gospels, he certainly was able to read and write because he read from the scrolls in a synagogue, and they would be in Hebrew, not Aramaic. He was able to communicate with Pilate, who would speak Greek. But if you look at the teaching of Jesus, it's dominated by parables that use visual imagery, events of real life. Not to provide neat answers of black and white, but to challenge us to work out the principles so that we could work them out for ourselves in ordinary life. The Bible is a book of principles, not rules. And we've got to ponder that. If we hang on to an archaic language in the Bible version we use, what are we saying to the wider world? our religion is out of date. That's what we're saying. And we have to admit that in the West there are large numbers draw that conclusion. And if we communicate in ways that are completely out of step with modern society, what are we saying to the wider world? The wider world does not base itself giving 20 minutes or 45-minute sermons without a visual. We're living in a visual age. In the days of Jesus they were living in a visual age as well, but for very different reasons. Many could not read or write. We've got to listen and learn the principles behind this in the way we communicate biblical truths. Central issue: languages are fluid, words are fluid, meanings change, but the meaning underpinning the language is absolutely central. Words are vehicles of meaning. Don't think of the words being inspired, it's the meaning that's inspired. Now some think that. Some come to that conclusion. This is taken from a church, a denominational document. We believe the Bible as originally given to be without error, the fully inspired and infallible Word of God, and the supreme and final authority in all matters of faith and conduct. Just think about it for a minute. We don't have the originals. We have ones that have got all, we're fairly confident are the same as the originals, but who today can read ancient Hebrew or Greek? Only a few. Language changes. The fully inspired and infallible Word of God that misunderstands the use of the word word in the Bible. 3 words can be translated into word in English. Only one of them refers to written word, and that's rarely used in the Bible. It's naive and flawed thinking. That's much better. God inspired the writers to bring meaningful insights to wider humanity. They used words as a vehicle of meaning, an unchanging meaning. And the words used may vary from time to time and from language to language, but the meaning doesn't change. And that's the central thrust of the biblical text. That's a much more helpful way to look at things. Now that's a reasonable assumption. If God made the universe, including us, it's reasonable to assume he wants to communicate with us. Now we've got to recognize an assumption. Some people don't recognize that there is a God, the universe just happened. Others see God as having created the universe and then leaving it to run itself, like a clock wound up and left to run. But if that assumption, and it is a reasonable assumption based on a lot of evidence, God wishes to communicate is a reasonable deduction. How would God do it? He's come to various individuals who are open to him and to listening to him. He's spoken to them, and he wants these insights to be passed on to others. And so these insights have been committed to writing in some form using some language so that they can be passed on to others. Now with that backcloth in mind, based on a reasonable assumption, it's sensible and to study the Bible in an English translation based on the best original documents. And most modern translations fulfill that criterion. The King James, New King James probably don't. Certainly the King James doesn't. And modern clear English, so that we can understand it in ordinary language and able to communicate it to others in ordinary language. So reject versions which have understandable flaws. Tyndale was brilliant. The motives of King James were outstanding, but they didn't have access to the original documents for good reasons. So their translations are understandably flawed. Don't use them. And if we use old versions, what we're saying to the wider world, religion is out of date, is set in the past. In practical terms, with a modern version, come to the text seeking to hear what God seeks to say to us. He spoke to someone in the past and he wanted it to be passed on. And come to the text saying, if I hear God speaking to me, I'm going to respond positively. Two great principles that will help us find the meaning of God's communication with humanity through the biblical text.